Hello, and thank you very much for joining me once again for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about keywording strategies and related workflow. And it's sort of funny, during my previous webinar presentation, there was a question, I think it was actually a little bit off topic for the webinar that I was presenting, but it related to keywording. And as soon as I addressed that question, the comments lit up with people requesting a webinar on keywording. I know it's a subject that a lot of photographers sort of struggle with to some extent, and so that is going to be our focus today. I do want to say to all of us in the United States, at least, a happy, slightly belated Thanksgiving. I hope you had a wonderful holiday. And of course, that means, for many of you, the tradition, of course, a big turkey dinner, and lots of emails about Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all the other days that get bundled in as part of that. And it reminded me, actually, last year we happened to be in Brazil right before Thanksgiving, and even there we saw Black Friday sales all over the place. This was in Parintins, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in Brazil along the Amazon River. And so, yes, of course, we too take part in that tradition of Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all those good things. And I'll give you the details of that at the end of today's presentation. And speaking of today's presentation, as it has been for quite a while now, it is sponsored by Tamron. So I want to thank Tamron very much for making this series of presentations available to all of you, to make it possible for us to bring these presentations to you as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. And be sure, if you haven't already, there's a video actually on the Tamron YouTube channel. It's at youtube.com/TamronVids. And if you look for the One Location, One Lesson, One Lens series, you can find a video of me out in the Palouse with an all-in-one lens trying to get some great photos. And speaking of me, I suspect you all know who I am. That's perhaps part of the reason that you signed up today, or at least you knew when you signed up for the webinar that it would be me presenting. And so I will be talking about keywording, as I mentioned. But also, it's sort of funny, when I'm putting together a presentation, sometimes I need a photo of me so I can actually introduce myself. And it at times can be a challenge to actually find a picture of me. Thank goodness that keywords can come to the rescue there. I can keyword photos with my own name, for example, so that I'll be able to find those keywords later. And also, one last mention, speaking of me, if you're not already following me on Instagram, I would most certainly love it if you would follow me and maybe like my photos if you're so inclined. I do try to share photos, especially when I'm traveling, but throughout the other times. Of course, most of the time I'm traveling, but I try to share photos along the way, and I encourage you to check those out and hopefully enjoy. But on to the business of the day, keywording strategies and workflow. I know it might not seem like the most exciting subject in the world, but it's an important one, and I know a subject that many photographers could benefit from giving some thought about. So let's talk about keywords. First and foremost, keywords essentially are really just another metadata field. In other words, there's lots of information about our photos. Our camera puts a variety of information into the photos, you might say, right from the start. And so we have information about which camera we used and what lens aperture the exposure was set to, the shutter speed, etc. So we can review those details. And of course, we can add additional details. So we can enter a title for the photos. We can put our copyright information into metadata. And one of those pieces of metadata, just another metadata field, is the keywords field. And that's where we can enter additional words, obviously, that are key to the photo that we're working with at the moment. So here, for example, this happens to be browsing in Adobe Bridge and looking at a photo of the island, the volcanic island of Stromboli in Italy. And so you can see the keyword Stromboli, volcano, Instagram share. More on that a little bit later. But more specifically, what are keywords? Well, the International Press Telecommunications Council, IPTC, defines it as this, which I'm not going to read to you, but the core nugget there is that essentially keywords describe the visible and the abstract content of the photo. In other words, what's actually in the photo? What is it a picture of, for example? And I guess you could say, what does the photo mean? Or what's the mood? Or, what does the photo communicate or symbolize or what have you? The concepts related to the photo, the abstract nature of the photo. And so we're essentially, in a lot of ways, you could say, describing the photo through keywords. So how important are those keywords really? And, I often describe this as how much time do you want to spend keywording? Given the choice, you could spend as much time as you'd like to adding keywords to your photos. How long would you spend doing that? And I think most photographers would agree the answer is none. It's not an exciting task. It's really more of a chore, I would say, for most of us. So ideally, you would not have to spend any time adding keywords to your photos. Then, when you're looking for a particular photo, suddenly you wish that you had spent lots and lots of time adding every possible keyword to your photos. And I had an example of this not too long ago. I was searching for a photo. Spoiler alert, thankfully, I found the photo. It's this photo. I was working on a project that related to Photoshop. I needed to demonstrate a particular technique, and when I'm going to demonstrate something in Photoshop, I want to make sure that I'm using an image that illustrates the concept well. And in this case, I was looking for an image that I could use to demonstrate the ability in Photoshop to create a selection based on areas that are in focus versus out of focus. So the foreground subject versus the background, for example. And I remember this photo and thought it would be great. But I couldn't find it. I didn't remember where I took it. I didn't know the name of the flower. I had nothing to go on. And I had not added any keywords to the photo. And I searched and searched and searched. I tried to look based on wide open aperture, for example, since it was narrow depth of field, based on star ratings. I figured it was at least in the last, certain number of years, and so I searched recent photos. I could not find it. And then, a long time later, after the project I was working on was already finished, I randomly stumbled upon the photo. It happens to have been captured at the Getty Center in Los Angeles, and it happens to be a flower called an allium, which happens to be related to, if I remember correctly, garlic. But I couldn't remember any of those details. Well, actually, I didn't know the name of the flower originally. I found out later. I think one of my audience members at a presentation actually told me what the flower was called when I did use the image in a presentation. But the point is that keywords really would have helped if I could have found this image by just typing in allium. That would have been so much easier. But of course, that requires actually adding keywords to the photos in the first place. So I wouldn't say that keywords are absolutely critical to everyone's workflow, but I'd say they certainly can be helpful. And so it's probably worth spending at least a little bit of time adding keywords to your images. Now, that actually raises a really interesting notion: the potential future obsolescence of keywords. Maybe at some point, I know it maybe sounds a little bit crazy, but maybe at some point we won't actually need keywords because we will be able to find our images through other means. Now, actually, the cloud version of Lightroom, as well as Photoshop Elements, the organizer that's included with Photoshop Elements, include essentially image analysis so that you can search for photos based on the contents of those photos without ever having to enter keywords. Why is this capability not in Lightroom Classic when it is in the cloud version of Lightroom? I have no idea, but hopefully it will find its way into Lightroom Classic at some point as well. But for example, in Lightroom, the cloud version, you could just type a word. So you type in waterfall, for example, because you're looking for a picture of waterfalls, and you come up with search results with absolutely no keywording necessary. I did not add a single keyword to any of the images that are included in this Lightroom Cloud catalog. And yet, Lightroom was able to find photos, including, as you can see here, the first handful of photos are legitimately of waterfalls. The other images, not exactly. Really, it's a river in a gorge, and sure, there's some rapids that form very small waterfalls, but obviously the image analysis, it's looking for certain textures, colors, etc., and it, you might say, mistook these river photos for waterfalls. But still, it's pretty impressive that we can just type a word, and through that image analysis, with no keywording whatsoever, I can actually find images that contain that subject matter. Naturally, it doesn't work for everything, and it doesn't necessarily work for concepts. If you type in speed or vibrant or something like that, a descriptive term, you're not necessarily going to get any photos that go along with it. But still, a rather impressive capability. If you neglected to add keywords to your photos or certain keywords to your photos, there's the potential that you could still find them thanks to that image analysis. Again, available in a variety of different software applications. Unfortunately, for those of us using Lightroom Classic, not yet available there, but this does suggest that down the road, we may get to the point where image analysis becomes so good that image analysis combined with the other metadata for our photos, we might not really need to keyword so much. At some point, I hope we'll look back at the notion of keywording and just laugh and laugh at how silly it was that we used to have to actually add keywords to our photos, that the computer didn't add them for us automatically. But for now, I think it's helpful to add keywords. It's essentially still necessary, even with some of the tools that are relatively rudimentary, but that give us the capability to find photos without keywords. I think still really helpful to actually add keywords to your images. But first, before you add keywords to your photos, I strongly recommend that you have already performed some other organizational tasks. I know many of you are already well aware that I am very keen on being organized, and that, for example, I like to keep my Lightroom catalog as tidy as possible. It's part of the reason that I created the Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course to help other photographers clean up a perhaps slightly messy or perhaps very messy catalog in Lightroom Classic. But the point is that I want to start with other, what I think of sort of core organizational steps. So using a folder structure, for example, to store the photos so that I can very likely find the image I'm looking for just by going to a folder. I'll give you a more specific example of that shortly. And then also adding star ratings or color labels perhaps, but the point is to identify, for example, favorite photos. And so that very often when I'm looking for a photo, here's these fishermen in a little boat at sunrise, and this happens to have been during my Austria photo workshop. This is actually just across the border in Bavaria in Germany. And when I want to find this photo, I can just go to the Austria 2019 folder, the folder that stores the images from that particular trip, and then filter based on star ratings, and I will find this image among my favorites from that trip. Of course, that requires that I remember that this particular photo was captured in Austria in 2019, so I can go to the right folder. But the point is that that gives me a very base level organization for my images. Very often I can find my photos just based on that information, just based on, oh, you want to see a photo of a crop duster? Let me go to my Palouse folders and filter by star ratings, and I can very likely find a crop duster photo very quickly. Then keywords take that to a next level. And so, for example, having gone to the Palouse every year for, I think it's been a little over 10 years now, and capturing lots and lots of photos when I'm out there, even filtering based on the Palouse and based on star ratings, it's not necessarily going to be quick and easy to find a particular image. So if I've added keywords, so much the better. That'll make that process that much faster. Plus, I can search for keywords across a wide variety of folders, even across my entire catalog. That said, some keywords are probably not necessary. In fact, I would say that even in some cases, you might find that you don't need to add keywords to any of the photos from a single photo outing. One example, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to photograph the Rolling Stones in concert. I certainly do not need any keywords to find these images. I can simply go into Lightroom and go into my Rolling Stones concert folder and there are my images. I can filter by star rating, so I can just see the favorites, for example, ignoring the outtakes, and that would enable me to find those particular photos very, very easily. There's no need to add, for example, Rolling Stones or concert as keywords to these images because they're so easy to find. That said, keywords could still be helpful. So, for example, wanting to identify the names of the individual members of the Rolling Stones that appear in a given photo, for example, then I would perhaps want to add those keywords, or maybe, something else that's topical. When there's a guitar solo, I might put guitar as a keyword, for example. But the point is that we don't always need to add perhaps keywords at all in some cases, or at least certain keywords where it's just sort of duplicative. And I think one of the key things to think about in that context, and sort of thinking about your strategy for adding keywords to your own photos, is the purpose of keywords, which we've talked about a little bit, but I actually think of there being two purposes for adding keywords to your photos. There are two reasons, essentially, two very basic reasons, important reasons that you might want to add keywords to a photo. Number one, of course, the most obvious, I imagine, is to locate specific photos. So let's say I want to show you a picture that I captured during a solar eclipse. I could just search solar eclipse in the keyword field, for example, and that will give me a search result that hopefully includes a picture of the solar eclipse. But there's another purpose, and that second purpose is to remind us of details within the photo. And so, for example, you're browsing images, working on a project, and you come across a photo that looks interesting, but you have no idea what it is. You know it was captured in Paris because it's in the Paris folder, but you don't necessarily remember the name of this interesting building with all of the plumbing on the outside. But if you keyworded the photo, then you could just go look at the keywords and you have your answer. So in this case, it is the Georges Pompidou building in Paris. And if I had added a keyword, not only could I search for the name that I might not have ever remembered, I could also remind myself of those details, find the image through other means, or randomly stumble upon the image, and I can look at the keywords to see what those additional details are. So the name of the building in this case. By the way, this is another example of why I'm such a huge fan of having GPS built into the camera, because then GPS coordinates are included with your photos as you're capturing them, as long as you're in clear view of a handful of GPS satellites so that you have a good location fix. But then you can use that information, those GPS coordinates, right inside of Lightroom Classic. You could just go to the map module for that photo, for example, and look on the map. The map module in Lightroom Classic makes use of Google Maps, and so you have all that information, including, the name of the businesses nearby, or the name of the building, or whatever the case might be. And so that can be very helpful as another supplement to keywording. When you are keywording, or when you're trying to decide how much time you have to spend adding keywords to your photos, you also want to consider your audience. So if, for example, you're submitting to stock agencies, such as Getty Images, perhaps, you don't have a choice. You must keyword. And in many cases, you need to add lots of keywords, and it's to your advantage in terms of your images being easier to find to keyword very, very well, which often means adding a fair number of keywords. I believe Getty recommends anywhere from 5 to 50 keywords per image. But many of us don't really submit images to stock agencies, for example, or others who might need to see keywords or make use of keywords for your photos, in which case the audience really is probably just you. And if it's just you, then I suppose you could say that the keywording is less important, it's less critical. But in some respects, it's actually even more important, because now it's you who's going to benefit from being able to find a particular image based on keywords, or it's you that's going to be frustrated if you can't find a photo because you didn't put the right keywords. So what are the right keywords then? How do you choose keywords? Well, as I mentioned early on, there's sort of those two categories, I suppose you could say, for keywords. the keywords either describe the actual contents of the image or the abstract concepts. So the actual subject matter. So this photo, for example, was captured in Florence, in Italy. And so Florence and Italy would be very obvious sort of subject matter based keywords for the image. But I also want to think about any concepts related to the photo, and more specifically, concepts that I might want to search for or concepts that I might want to be reminded of. And so in this case, for example, the photo obviously was captured at night, and more specifically at blue hour, and so you might add a keyword for blue hour. Of course, this is another one that I would hope that automatic searching would be capable of finding for us. For example, based on the GPS coordinates, knowing the location where the photo was captured, and based on the timestamp in metadata, the computer, the software, could calculate when would blue hour be for that location, that time of year, for example, what time was sunset, and giving a, maybe a 1 hour window from the time after sunset for that blue hour, we could find the images relatively quickly and easily, but that doesn't exist in any software that I know of, and so a keyword would be a good solution. And then also, maybe just key terms you think you might want to search for or be reminded of later. So, for example, this particular church is referred to as the Duomo, and so we might add Duomo as a keyword. It was photographed in Florence, of course, but more specifically from Piazzale Michelangelo, and so we might add that as a keyword also to the image. And of course, in many cases, the keywords are really, really obvious. This photo from the Palouse, you can bet that I would add Red Barn as a keyword. I would add moon, more specifically full moon. And so some of those keywords really, really obvious, pretty straightforward, and you don't need to think about them too much. But I think it's helpful to think about some of the less obvious keywords as well. This photo captured in Rome, Italy, during one of the photo workshops I was leading there. And this view, which is, I think, a very nice, interesting view of the cathedral through this arch created by the foliage in the foreground, sort of this tunnel view. But one of the things that's maybe more interesting about this view, about the experience of seeing this view, is that to see this and to photograph this, you have to look through a keyhole in a door. And you have to get your lens right up against that keyhole in order to photograph through the keyhole. And so I would add, in this case, keyhole as a keyword. In fact, that's how we talk about this location. We're going to the keyhole. There is the keyhole. It's not just any keyhole in Rome. It's a very specific one that has this wonderful view. And so you can just refer to the keyhole in Rome, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Or I might add keywords such as unique, because this is a somewhat unique view, or framing, because it's an example of framing up your subject, in this case through some foliage. And so thinking about the less obvious keywords, the concepts, really the way I generally think about it is, when I'm looking for a photo, what's going to come to mind? Or when I find a photo, what sorts of details might I need to be reminded of? And so adding some of the less obvious keywords can be very, very helpful. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that not every possible keyword is necessary. I gave the example of the Rolling Stones concert a bit ago, but here's a photo. It includes sand. So would I add sand as a keyword? Yes, definitely. Sand, in large part, is the reason that I took this photo. And would I include door? Definitely, because if I'm looking for this photo, sand and door, those are very obvious key concepts. How about Kolmanskop? The name of the town, the ghost town where I captured this image? Definitely, because I'm probably not going to remember that name for very long, and so when I find this photo, I will want to be able to look at the keywords and remind myself of the name of the town. Or when someone says, hey, have you ever been to Kolmanskop? And I say, I'm not sure. Let me search my catalog and see. I can search for that keyword. And then Namibia, which is the country in Africa where this image was captured. Certainly I would add Namibia and Africa as keywords as well. But what about footprints? There are footprints in the sand. So shall I add footprints as a keyword? I would say no. Probably not, or in my case, I would say definitely not. I'm not sure that I'm necessarily happy that there were footprints in the sand in this particular case. I might have been tempted to rake the sand and smooth it out a little bit, but more importantly is I'm not going to search based on footprints, or I don't need to be reminded that there are footprints in this image. And so I would not add that as a keyword. In other words, I'm not just looking at the image and trying to think of every single possibility, wood and paint and light and shadows and, whatever the case might be. I'm not just trying to create a laundry list of every possible keyword that I could type for every single image, but rather the key concepts, the most important things that I'm going to search for or want to be reminded of. That said, you might also consider what I refer to as fake keywords. And really all I mean by that is keywords that are not being added for what you might say are the normal purposes, for searching for an image or being reminded of some concept or detail about the image. So here, for example, a photo that I was able to capture, and this happens to be in Senegal, in Africa, at Lake Retba. So if I want to find this photo, I might search for Lake Retba, or perhaps more likely, I will have forgotten the name of the lake, and so I will want to add Lake Retba as a keyword initially so that I can then find the image and remind myself of exactly what the name of the lake was. And so I would add a variety of keywords, both in terms of describing the contents of the image, but also maybe some of the concepts of the image. But I also might add to some images keywords for a totally different purpose. And so for me, for example, I use keywords, these fake keywords as I refer to them, as a way to identify which photos have been used in a particular project. So looking at the keywords for this image, you can see that Instagram share, all one word, is added as a keyword. Well, as I mentioned, I share some of my photos from travels on Instagram, and I like to keep track of which images I have shared on Instagram, in part so I know which images I have not yet shared on Instagram, so that they're, you might say, available to be shared because I haven't shared them already. I might mark images as having been included in a particular book project, for example, or if you sell images in a gallery, you might mark them with one of these keywords that indicates that it's on display in the gallery or it has been submitted to the gallery or whatever the case might be. The point is keywords that essentially just benefit your workflow. I'm not necessarily going to need to search for images based on a project, although certainly that could be a possibility. And these sorts of keywords don't describe the contents or the concepts related to the photo, but I do find that these types of keywords can be tremendously helpful. Just to essentially add an extra layer of organization to your workflow for a variety of purposes, for essentially any purpose that you can imagine. Anytime you need to know something about a photo or locate a particular photo, you can use a keyword for that purpose. And keeping in mind, we can also locate photos that don't have a keyword. So I can say, show me my images with a high star rating, but that do not have Instagram share as a keyword, so that I can find images I like that I've not yet shared on Instagram. I think a good example of some of the things we need to think about when it comes to our keywords is scientific names. So if you do any nature, any wildlife photography, you photograph an animal. So here, it was just a fluke. Yes, I apologize. The fluke of a whale. And so I have this picture. I want to add some keywords so I can find that image later. And one of the keywords that I could add would be, well, I don't know how to pronounce it because I didn't know these words until I searched on Google to track down what is the scientific name of this animal, and it is Megaptera. I won't even try the other one. Maybe one of you knows how to pronounce it properly, but I do not. I certainly would never remember. As soon as I turn the page on this presentation, I will have forgotten already. In fact, I've never even remembered the scientific name of this animal. So adding that as a keyword would frankly be just silly. I'm never going to search for this word, these words, and if I need to know the word, I can search on Google. And so instead, I would add a keyword that makes sense to me. And I think it's an important concept to keep in mind when it comes to keywording your photos, is it needs to be the keywords rather, that make sense to you. When you're thinking about a photo, what words come to mind? When you're searching for a particular image, what terms are going to come to mind? And so in this case, it would be humpback whale, not whatever that scientific name was. If I need the scientific name, I'll go to Google and search humpback whale, and I'll find the Wikipedia article, for example, that will tell me what that scientific name is. But for me personally, that's not going to do any bit of good. And so there's no sense for me to add that. Now, for some of you, of course, if you're doing a lot of wildlife, a lot of nature photography, then you might know the scientific names in some cases better than you know the common names. So I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to add scientific names to keywords, but it's an example of a situation where an obvious keyword, for example, is not necessarily one that makes any sense for me whatsoever. Another thing that I think is worth considering when it comes to keywording is how you're formatting them. So I've already made reference to some words, keywords, that actually consist of more than one word. So you go to Paris and you photograph the Eiffel Tower. Eiffel Tower, it's two words, but it's one keyword. You can have spaces in your keywords. When you're entering your keywords in whatever software you happen to be using to manage your photos, you can separate the keywords themselves by commas or semicolons, and you can include spaces so that Eiffel Tower is one word. I can search specifically for the term Eiffel Tower with the space in it, as opposed to having two separate words, one for Eiffel, one for tower. But I also consider things like singular versus plural. So for this image, this happens to be a pair of kudus in Africa, and so kudu is an obvious keyword, but would I add it as just kudu or kudus, singular or plural? Now, in fairness, if I add this a keyword to this image as kudus, plural with an S, and I search for kudu without the S, I'm still going to see this image in the search results because kudu and kudus share those common sets of letters, and I can search based on a keyword being inclusive of certain terms. So kudu versus kudus. That said, I could also require in my search that it be specific. Most software will allow you to search specifically for only kudu singular versus only kudus plural if you set that option. That's all well and good for the typical scenario where we just add an S to the word or an ES to the word, but what if it's a picture of geese? Then searching for goose will not necessarily turn up geese, or vice versa. There's another solution that I'll talk about shortly, but it's something that I think is worth considering, being consistent essentially in how you format your keywords, and possibly, for example, always using the singular form rather than the plural form. Whatever you do, make sure that you type carefully, or use a list, which I'll talk about momentarily. But when I'm typing the name of the town where I captured this photo, I would remember that this particular photo was captured in Croatia, but I might not remember the name of the town. And even if I knew the name of the town, I might not know exactly how to pronounce it, and I certainly might not know how to spell it. So in this case, I believe it's pronounced Opatija, and it is spelled with a J in there, Opatija. So I need to be very careful. That's not a word that I think is necessarily easy to spell or obvious to spell, since it's a Croatian word, essentially, Croatian name of a city. And so I would want to be very, very careful when I'm typing that word, or if I'm adding this keyword that I've already used in the past to another image, then I might want to use a list. So in Lightroom Classic, for example, or in Adobe Bridge and other software applications as well, when you add keywords to a photo, those keywords get put onto essentially this master list of all of the available keywords. That list can get pretty long. Fortunately, as you can see up at the top here of the keyword list, there is a search field. You can filter the keywords, so you could start typing the keyword in that search field, for example, to get to the specific keyword you want to add more quickly and easily. But these keywords on the list actually serve as checkboxes. You can hover your mouse over the keyword, and over to the left, you'll see a little box that you can click on in order to add a check mark to that box so that you can add the keyword and actually see which keywords have been added to each particular image, the image that you're currently browsing. And most importantly, having this keyword list and using this keyword list as your method for adding keywords to photos helps to ensure consistency of spelling, for example, as well as your vocabulary, so that you'll remember that, it was kudu singular versus plural because that's the only word on the list that looks like kudu. And so that list can be very helpful. It's not going to be as fast as being able to just type the keyword. Well, that is, if you can type reasonably fast anyway. I could type a keyword faster than I could scroll through and find it on the list, for example. But I also might type it wrong if I'm typing as opposed to just checking a box on a list. And speaking of that list, you might consider using a controlled vocabulary. And what that means essentially is a list of keywords that somebody else, hopefully, has created that list for you. There's one option that I found, for example, that includes more than 11,000 keywords. So that instead of typing words, you could just scroll through the list. I think that probably makes it obvious that it could potentially be a bit overwhelming as well. If you've got a list of 11,000 keywords to scroll through, that's a lot of scrolling. It's a lot of possible keywords. Many of those keywords you're probably never going to use. But the idea of a controlled vocabulary is that it makes sure that you're using only words that actually exist, for example, that you're being consistent in how you're applying those keywords. And so, for example, there is a Lightroom keyword list project where you can get keyword lists in a few categories for free. There are some paid options as well, where you have essentially a curated list of keywords generally categorized by subject matter. So, animals versus flowers, for example, would be in a different category. But the point is that you can use that list to help make sure that you're using the right terms and that you're using them consistently. So it's worth considering, it's worth looking at. For me personally, I kind of find it a bit cluttered and a bit overwhelming. And so my personal preference is to focus on my approach to keywording rather than a specific controlled vocabulary, so that I'm just trying to be thoughtful when I'm adding keywords, but I just add the keywords that I need rather than going through a huge list. It can also be incredibly helpful to take advantage of keyword synonyms. So if you're using a controlled vocabulary, you might find all sorts of related terms. And you could apply multiple terms to the same image, obviously, multiple keywords. But in software such as Lightroom Classic, you also have the ability to identify synonyms for keywords. So, for example, a photo captured in Rome, perhaps I want to use the Italian version of Rome as a synonym. So Roma in this case, or maybe it was Italy versus Italia. And so I can add those keywords as synonyms, essentially a different word that means the same thing. And so here, Rome and Roma. And the interesting thing is that then when I add Rome, the English spelling, as a keyword to a photo, the Italian spelling, the synonym, is not added as a keyword. You won't see it on the keyword list. However, when I search for images based on keywords, if I search for Roma, the Italian spelling, as opposed to Rome, the English spelling, the image will still appear in the search results. And in fact, you can see that there's a checkbox here in the Create Keyword Tag dialog. You can get to this dialog by clicking the plus symbol to the left of the keyword list heading on the right panel in the library module in Lightroom Classic. If you have the Export Synonyms checkbox turned on, if you export a photo from your catalog and you include keywords as part of the metadata, in other words, you're exporting metadata because you can choose not to export metadata with your photos, for example, with this checkbox, the Export Synonyms checkbox turned on, when I export the image, for example, to send it to a stock agency, both Rome and Roma will be included as keywords. So when you're adding keywords, rather than just typing to add a keyword to the photo, you might click that plus button in Lightroom Classic to add a keyword so that you get this dialog for creating a keyword tag, which gives you the option to add synonyms for your keywords. It can also potentially be helpful to make use of hierarchical keywords. So first and foremost, what's a hierarchical keyword? Well, we know, for example, that a bald eagle is an eagle is a raptor, and a raptor is a bird. And so if I add the keyword bald eagle and it's part of a hierarchy, then once I know that this is a bald eagle, I also know that it is an eagle, it is a raptor, it is a bird. So it gives me some context. It's similar in basic concept to the synonyms. There's just one problem when it comes to hierarchical keywords, or a core problem anyway, and that is there's no such thing. There is not a metadata definition for hierarchical keywords. We have all sorts of other metadata fields, star ratings, for example, or we have the color label, which is just a label field. So we have metadata fields that have these clear definitions of how they're to be used. With keywords, there's no actual standard definition of hierarchical keywords other than just the obvious fact that they are hierarchical keywords, but in other words, the implementation. And in fact, hierarchical keywords are implemented differently in different software. And so there's not an established standard. So if you're using one software application and you switch to another, you won't necessarily retain your keyword hierarchies as part of that process. That said, obviously, hierarchical keywords can be potentially helpful, especially as an aid to your workflow efficiency. So let's take the example of an adorable little lemur, in this case a white sifaka, and we know that a lemur is a mammal, and so we could define a hierarchy. So when entering a keyword in Lightroom, for example, Lightroom Classic, we could type mammal is greater than lemur. And so we use the greater than or less than symbols. We could type these in any order, well, either of the two orders. So we could say mammal first or mammal last, and then we just use the greater than or less than symbol with the open side. I think of this as the larger side as being the parent, as it were, in the relationship. So a lemur is a mammal, but not every mammal is a lemur, and so mammal is the larger category, if you will, and so the open side of the greater than or the less than symbol, the greater than side, if you will, is the side that would point to mammal as opposed to lemur, but you could type it in either direction just using the correct symbol. So a lemur is a mammal, but there's also lots of stuff in between. So for example, considering how deep we want that hierarchy to go, would we call it mammal is, well, in this case, going back in the other direction, a lemur is a primate is a mammal, or it's a mammal and it's a primate and it's a lemur? Or would we potentially go even deeper into that hierarchy? And of course, this, in my case at least, would require a Google search to find the kingdom and the phylum and the order and all the other classifications here, so that I can't even pronounce most of these words correctly probably, but I see that it's an animal, and somewhere in there it's a mammal and it's a primate, and we work our way down essentially to the scientific name for the animal. So when it comes to hierarchies, you also need to consider how deep that hierarchy is going to go. If it's a particular building located in a particular neighborhood of a particular city, in a county, in a state, in a time zone, in a region, in a country, on a continent, on the planet, in the solar system, etc., how deep do you really need to take those hierarchies? But that's something that I would suggest, if you're going to use hierarchies, that you think about ahead of time. And note, by the way, that in Lightroom Classic, you can actually use drag and drop to define hierarchies. So let's say you had individual keywords for raptor, for eagle, for bald eagle. We can actually drag, so for example, drag eagle onto raptor, or drag bald eagle onto eagle. You would actually obviously do both of those to create this 3-level hierarchy, so that when I add the keyword, because I've defined this hierarchy by dragging bald eagle onto eagle and eagle onto raptor right on the keyword list on the right panel in the library module of Lightroom Classic. Now that I've defined that hierarchy, when I add bald eagle as a keyword to an image, the other related keywords, raptor and eagle, very similar to synonyms, those other keywords are not automatically added to the keywords for my photo. However, by association, a search, so for example, a search for raptor will still yield the image that has a bald eagle keyword, because the bald eagle keyword is in a hierarchy. It falls below raptor in the hierarchy, therefore searching for raptor shows me bald eagle. So that obviously gives us a workflow advantage in that we can add fewer keywords to our images, but have the benefit of essentially a larger number of keywords with very little effort, just defining, of course, the hierarchies in the first place. But I do recommend that we be careful with those hierarchy definitions, and with assigning those keywords, sometimes they might have unintended consequences. I refer to these as false hierarchies that aren't exactly necessarily accurate. So, for example, let's say that you signed up for the Adopt an Eagle program. You adopted an eagle through the World Wildlife Fund program, and as part of that, you get a little bundle of goodies, one of which is a stuffed animal of a bald eagle. And you photograph that bald eagle, so now you want to add the bald eagle, for example, as a keyword, but maybe that now means that when you search for eagle, raptor, animal, I mean, certainly this represents a bird, but it's not an actual animal. At least it's not a living animal, so you might not want this image to show up in a search result for animal. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. The point is that you just need to be thoughtful about hierarchies, in that sometimes the keyword that you're adding to an image, the child keyword in that hierarchy, if you will, as opposed to the parent, you add that child keyword, that actual keyword, the parents in that hierarchical structure don't necessarily apply to every image. So just something to keep in mind when you're defining those hierarchies and adding keywords to a photo based on hierarchies. And then I think, as I mentioned right from the start, ideally I wouldn't have to keyword my photos very much at all, but at some point I probably hopefully I realize how beneficial keywords can really be in terms of locating specific photos or reminding myself of what, particular kind of animal this is, for example. And so keywording can be helpful, but I don't want to keyword every single photo. That would take forever. And I don't tend to delete all that many photos, so it really could take a long time with many trips. And so instead, my personal approach is to essentially only add keywords to my favorite images. So I mentioned organizing photos based on folder structure, assigning star ratings to identify your favorite photos or your best photos from a given trip, and then also being able to use those tools to locate the images, and then using keywords as a supplemental tool. Well, that means that by the time I'm adding keywords, I've typically reviewed my photos for star ratings, and I actually only assign keywords typically to images that have a star rating, to my favorites. If I want to find out details or search for an image that doesn't have a star rating, I can still find the image with the star rating and probably very easily in the same folder find related images that just didn't happen to have a star rating. So I could search by keyword, and then of course that's going to find the image with the star rating, but I can also find the neighboring photos without the star rating, without the keyword, because they're in the same folder right next to the photo that I actually found. So for me, I find that just keywording my favorite images streamlines the overall workflow, and I still have the ability to locate the images that I need. One other consideration, a little workflow tip, is to add one keyword at a time. This is essentially an assembly line approach to adding keywords to your photos. And so, for example, in Lightroom Classic, we have the Painter tool. So down on the toolbar below the grid view display, you'll find the Painter, And then once we've selected the painter, you can choose what we want to paint onto the image. So here you might be able to make out that text. I have selected keywords from the pop-up for the painter, and in the field there I've typed in zebra. I could add multiple keywords separated by a comma, for example, and then I simply click on an image to add that keyword, in this case zebra, to the image, or I could click and drag. So the middle row here, all 4 of those images include a zebra, and so I could click on the first image on the left side of the zebra and keep the mouse button down and drag across those other 3 images so that the zebra keyword is added to all 4. And so I think an African safari is a really good example. You're going to see a wide variety of animals, but you're going to see them in a sort of random order. You see some elephants, then you see zebras, then you see a warthog, then kudus, then you see more elephants, then there's a lion, then maybe more elephants still, and then some more zebras, whatever the case might be. So the photos kind of appear in a random order, more or less. And so that I find it faster, instead of going to each image, okay, this one is an elephant, and that one is a kudu, and this one is a warthog, I'll just set the painter tool to keywords and put in the applicable animal, so zebra, and then I'll click and drag on all of the photos, just scrolling through, and you can do that pretty quickly. Then I'll switch to elephant, and then I'll switch to whatever other animals I photographed on that trip. So I do find in many cases, especially when there's a lot of images, and especially when there's not a tremendous range of subject matter. Maybe I saw a total of, a dozen different types of animals or whatever it might have been, versus doing street photography and photographing hundreds and hundreds of different buildings, for example. But in cases where the keywording is relatively straightforward, I do find that using that painter can be very, very efficient. And then finally, before we get to questions here, I'm sure there are some questions that have popped up along the way. The most important thing is, number one, to plan ahead, to think about keywording, which is the whole point of today's presentation, to help you think about some of the concepts related to adding keywords to your photo. So sort of coming up with a plan, an approach that you're going to use for your keywording, and then to be consistent, to kind of always use the same approach, to always use the same syntax, the same format, the same words to describe certain concepts, etc. So taking advantage of all the different capabilities, features, concepts that I've talked about, but making a plan for yourself, or redefining a plan if maybe you've not been so consistent in the past, and then implementing that plan and doing so consistently so that you will hopefully always be able to find the image you're looking for when you're looking for it, and also to be able to remind yourself of key details about the photo. All right, so we've got some questions here. And so while I'm addressing those questions, I'll remind you that yes, indeed, we had a Black Friday special on the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, $70 off of that subscription. So you can use, it is still active, the coupon code Black Friday at greylearning.com, or just use this convenient link, timgrey.me/Black Friday, and that will take you directly there. All right, so some questions from the audience here. So first off, Tayo asks, how do I delete keywords I no longer want available? Well, inside of Lightroom Classic, that's actually remarkably easy. You simply right-click on a keyword in the keyword list, and you'll see on the pop-up menu an option to delete. Note, very important, when you delete a keyword from the keyword list in Lightroom, it will also remove that keyword from all applicable photos. So you're not just removing the keyword from the list, you'll actually be removing the photo from the keyword from all photos to which it had been applied. Of course, that could be a good thing. I'm not suggesting I've ever done this, but if this were to ever happen, if I were to spell a word incorrectly, yes, I've done that on more than one occasion, especially with some of those names of cities that were difficult to spell. I typed it wrong and didn't realize it at the time. Then I started adding the keyword correctly to other images. Well, I can then add the correct spelling to all of the keywords that have the wrong spelling and simply delete the wrong spelling from the list. Gerald asks a real important question here. He says, keywords are fine, I get it, but how do you remember what the keywords were that you used years later? And the answer is, I don't know. That's part of the challenge, actually. It's sort of why keywords are necessary, actually. So it's a great question in that regard. In that part of the reason I want the keywords is because I'm not going to remember where did I photograph, that flower. It was purple. There were other flowers behind it. I can picture it in my mind, but I can't find it. And so the idea is that keywords are going to give you the opportunity to search for photos that you might otherwise have had a more difficult time finding. So searching, maybe I added keyword flower and purple, but maybe years down the line, I might not remember that that flower was an allium, and I might have no way to figure that out. I can search on Google all day long and never be able to come up with the name of that flower. I think we just have to recognize that sometimes that's just going to happen. We're going to forget. I'm going to forget what lens I used, what lens aperture I used, etc. But hopefully I'll remember some details. Sometimes I'll remember the keyword, sometimes I won't, but better to have it there so that I can put it to use if at all possible. All right, let's see here. Richard asks in regards to hierarchical keywords, keyword hierarchies, it does not need to enter the whole hierarchy when you're searching for the top level. And so, no, let's just say it's bird, raptor, bald eagle, for example, is your hierarchy. I can add only bald eagle as long as I've defined that hierarchy. I don't need to add the entirety to the image. I can simply add bald eagle as a keyword, and the hierarchy has already been defined. So essentially Lightroom knows the relationship automatically for you. All right, let's see here. A really good question, actually. Roger asked, why use keywords for places when there's a field for this, a location field? And it's a really great point because, I talked about different concepts that you might use keywords for, but sometimes what you're putting in the keyword could have also fit into another field. The title field, a caption field, there's the model field, for example, if you're photographing people. And so depending on your particular type of photography, you might have need for some of those other fields. Frankly, to me, it's just a workflow consideration. I'd rather put all of my information in one place, essentially, in keywords, rather than having the location information over there, the people in the photos, names over in another field, etc., etc. I like having it all just in one place. I find that that's more convenient for my workflow. I'm doing the data entry essentially all in one place. So really, it's just a workflow consideration. And certainly if you're submitting to stock, for example, you'll need a title and a caption. In some cases, you might need location and model information, etc. And then Lars asks about using geographic keywords in a hierarchy. So, for example, I showed an image from Senegal, which is in Africa, and Lake Retba, and so I could certainly define a hierarchy for all of those. I actually don't tend to use hierarchical keywords very much, partly because that sort of clutter that I talked about, where like using controlled vocabulary where your list is very long. Now I've got all these stacks of hierarchies. And so for me, maybe this is foolish, but I take the approach, I make the assumption that down the road, I'll remember that the photo was captured in Senegal, which happens to be in Africa, that I'll know some of these other details. So I could add Paris to a keyword. I don't necessarily need to add France as a keyword, but obviously I could define that as a hierarchy, but I find that I don't always need the hierarchy. And so I tend to just kind of keep it simple. So for Eiffel Tower, yes, I would add Eiffel Tower, Paris, and France, but I don't feel to add Europe to that equation, for example. So Joe makes mention of the fact that in Lightroom Classic, depending on your display resolution, you're not going to be able to see the entire list of keywords on the keyword list. And so if you're not able to see all of them, you're going to have to scroll. And actually, it looks like he's having an issue where he's not able to scroll, which would be a separate matter altogether. But it is often an issue where you're not able to see the entirety of the list. You should be able to hover your mouse over the keyword list itself and start scrolling that way. But keep in mind also that you can use that search field. And in the search field, you can type multiple words. And so you could search for both eagle and river because you want to have photos that include either of those subjects. So you want to find those particular keywords to add to an image. So you can actually add multiple in that search field. And so David asks about painting, likes the concept of painting keywords using that painter in Lightroom Classic. If he does that multiple times, will they be all added? So if you add multiple times, you're always only adding unless you switch to subtract mode, essentially. And so you don't need to worry about, if you're not sure whether or not you've added the keyword, you can just click again and it will be added if it's not already there. All right, let's see here. Yeah, so this is a related question from Terry about the location information. Would you recommend applying the location both in the keywords and in the IPTC, the sublocation field or the location fields? And I would say that's only necessary in my mind if you've got somebody else as your audience for your photos and for your metadata. And so if you're submitting to a stock agency, for example, they'll typically require that some of those fields be filled in. But as I mentioned before, in many cases, I think that the keywords field can be the only place that you add some of those details, the location information, unless you need it for another bit of workflow. So for example, the title and caption fields can be used as part of sharing. So posting to Facebook, for example, the title and caption in your Lightroom metadata, in your catalog, can be included as the title and caption for the photo when you actually post it to Facebook from inside of Lightroom Classic. And so there certainly are reasons in your workflow that you might want to fill in those other fields, but to me, I think keywords is a great place to start. All right, let's see. Yeah, Sherry points out that there is a risk of losing the keyword list. And in fact, you can export that keyword list and import as with a controlled vocabulary. So not a bad idea. I don't know necessarily what would cause a keyword list to be lost other than a corruption of a catalog, for example, but you can export and import keyword lists. And then, George mentions that he uses a date structure essentially as a keyword. And so, the year, the month, and the day, for example. I have not ever found it personally necessary to add keywords for dates, in large part because, to me, the date is already there. It's already in metadata, the date and time of capture, and so I can always search based on that metadata. I don't feel the need to have that information as a keyword. That said, if the timing of the photo, I gave the example of blue hour, for example, if the timing itself is important, then I will use abstract concepts. So, for example, autumn as a keyword for an image of fall colors. And so if there's a concept, then I would do that, but I don't generally add dates to keyword, as strictly as a date, the year, month, and day, for example, simply because that's already available to me elsewhere and it's very simple to search for. That said, if you find it helpful to have that information in the keywords field, then by all means, I would encourage you to do so. Because the bottom line is that, especially when it comes to keywording your photos, the same approach doesn't work for every single photographer. And so you're going to need to figure out what works for you. Some of the approaches that I use, you might think are just silly or reckless, and you take a completely different approach. And maybe, hopefully, some of the ideas I've shared resonate with you and make sense to you. But really, I think it's important to come up with a unique workflow for keywording that makes the most sense for you and your particular needs, and then just be sure to follow that approach consistently. All right, we're out of time. We went a little bit over time. I wanted to try to get to as many of those questions as possible. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email those to me, and I will address as many of those as I possibly can in an upcoming edition of the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, which hopefully all of you already get, but if you don't, you can go to asktimgray.com, and there's a field there for you to sign up so that you can get the question and answer emails that I send out every weekday, essentially, with questions from readers that I share my answers to those questions. So thanks again for joining me today for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. I hope you found it very helpful and maybe a little entertaining. Thank you also to Tamron for sponsoring this series of presentations. And I believe that this is probably the last webinar for this year, for 2019, but I'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar in 2020 and beyond. Thanks very much. Hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you soon.